Today we will be solving one-step equations. So if you remember, an equation is kind of like an expression except that it will have an equal sign in it. And your goal when you're solving these is that you are going to get the variable by itself, which gives you the number that that variable represents. So we'll just start straight away with some examples. The examples, the directions will say anything from solve to solve the equation to solve for x. So you'll see it a few different ways. Right now I'll write solve for x. So our first example is x minus 4 equals 8. In order to figure out what x is, we need to look at the number that's with the x, which is the minus 4, and do the inverse of subtracting 4. So remember that the inverse of subtraction is addition, so we are going to add 4 to both sides. You're going to bring down your x. So minus 4 plus 4, it doesn't just disappear, it actually is going to become 0. If you want, you can write it as x plus 0, but generally people don't usually write that, they just write it as x. Most of the time we just cross it out. And usually we skip that middle step with the writing plus 0, and we will just write the answer right away, which is x equals 12. So in order to check that out and to make sure it's right, what you can do is you can take the original equation, substitute that 12 back in for x, and double check. We know that 12 minus 4 is 8. We're very happy because 8 equals 8. So we're done with that problem. Now, most people can check this one in their head. They can say, okay, if I put 12 back in for x, what will I get? So if you can do that, that's fine. I do recommend that when you're taking a test or a quiz that you do work it out and check your answer. I think that's always a good habit to get into, especially when things get more complicated. So now, if you want, you can do this one on your own. So go ahead and pause. Okay, so our first step on this is we do the inverse of plus 8, which is minus 8. We do that to both sides. So we bring down our x, cross out your 8's, which because they're equal to 0, bring down your equals. 13 minus 8 is 5, and that is my answer. I'm not going to do the checking every single time, but I do recommend that you just think about it in your head, make sure that 5 plus 8 is 13, which it is, so you're good. So next problem, I have 5x equals 20. So if you remember, 5x is the same thing as 5 times x. You don't need to write that times, but some people like to do it because it helps them remember what's going on, but most of the time we just write it as 5x. So the inverse of multiplying x by 5 would be to divide it by 5. And we know that 5 divided by 5 is 1. We bring down our x, bring down our equals. We get 4 when we divide those. By the way, that 1 is another thing that's not usually written in front of the x. However, if it helps you out, definitely write it. If you think it's just an extra thing to write, then you don't need to. You can just write your answer as x equals 4. Once again, you can go back and check in order to make sure that you got it right. For this problem, go ahead and press pause and try it on your own. So I hope you tried the problem. You would start by dividing, and then you will get x equals. On the right-hand side, you might notice that this is not a nice number. It is a fraction. However, I don't want you to spend a lot of time trying to get mixed numbers, because actually, when you get to harder math classes, it's a lot easier to manipulate the numbers by leaving them as improper fractions. So we're going to leave this as 22 over 3. That is your whole entire answer, and when you get to a test or a quiz, I'd actually like you to keep it that way, please. So then, next problem, I have x over 3 equals 12. So the number one mistake that people make on this one is they think that the answer is 4, because 3 times 4 is 12. However, be very, very, very careful, because you are dividing x by 3. You need to solve it by doing the inverse of dividing by 3, which is going to be multiplying both sides by 3. So we're going to multiply both sides by 3 here. On the left-hand side, what's going to happen is your 3 being multiplied by x and your 3 dividing by x, or dividing x, are going to cancel out. And in the end, you will have just plain old x on the left-hand side. On the right side, you will get 36, and that's your answer. So our next problem is one of those ones that looks pretty tough and kind of painful. However, it's actually not that tough or painful, thankfully. So for this type of problem, there's a few ways to solve it. I'm actually going to show one method in the next problem, number 7. But for now, what I can do is I can actually rewrite this. And the way I can rewrite it is as 1x over 2 equals 6. And if you remember, 1x is just the same as x, so I end up getting x over 2 equals 6. You may notice that this problem now looks very similar to number 5. So you can solve it by multiplying both sides by 2. And in the end, you will be left with x equals 12. Our last problem is going to involve a fraction. I have 3 over 5x equals 4. So this one causes a lot of people to get a little bit worried because there is a fraction there. But we have a way that's not too horrible to get rid of fractions. So if you remember, we actually do the inverse to this. The inverse of this is dividing by a fraction, which in this case is not very pleasant. There's actually an easier way to do it. So the easier way to do it is to take your equation and try to get rid of that fraction. We do that by multiplying the 3 over 5 by its reciprocal, which is 5 over 3. What's going to happen is then the 5's are going to cancel out. It would just give you 1 and 1. The 3's are going to cancel out. You're actually, on the left-hand side, going to be left with just x. Do not forget the all-important rule of working with equations, and that is that if you do something to one side of the equation, you have to do it to the other. So on this side, I'm going to get 5 over 3 times 4. Since I'm working with fractions, I'm going to write it as 4 over 1. And in the end, I will get 20 over 3. It's another thing that doesn't simplify nicely, but you can just leave it as an improper fraction. For the last part of this section, we're going to be doing some word problems. So I'll just give you one today for your notes, and then in class we're going to do a bunch more. The first thing that I want to just mention is that we have an important formula. I think most of you probably have seen it. I hope you have. It's very important. You'll use it all the time in your everyday life, especially if you're driving a car or you're going on a long trip. and that is distance equals rate times time. So don't forget that rate is just a fancy way to say speed. So we're going to do one example. And so my first example is Miss Becker ran 8 miles yesterday. If it took her an hour and a half, what is her average speed? So the way that we do word problems at Lorena is we like to do a 3-step process. And I actually will be grading all of these when I do a test or a quiz on all 3 of these steps. So my first step is going to be to define a variable. And I will ask you these on the test. I'll actually write out define a variable. So by define a variable, I don't mean give me the definition of a variable. I mean tell me what it is that we don't know and what we're trying to find. So if you look closely, the very last sentence of this is what is her average speed? So we're wondering what's my average speed, Miss Becker's average speed. So in this, I'm going to call it S equals Miss Becker's average speed. So my second thing that I need for this problem is to write an equation. Luckily, on this one, I made it a little bit easier for you by giving you the formula up at the top. Distance equals rate times time. So we know that the distance is 8 miles. The rate is not given to us, but that was the variable I defined, which is S. The time we know is an hour and a half. I'm going to write that as 1.5. So then you now have an equation. It'll look a little bit nicer if you write it as 8 equals 1.5s, or if you even write it as 1.5s equals 8. Either of these last two is fine with me. I like this last one the best. It just looks nice and in order, but you can do it however you want to. So then our last step is to solve. And you probably already feel pretty comfortable about solving this. The only thing that might make you a little bit uneasy is that there's a decimal in it. But you're just going to use the same process. I'll even be super nice and let you use a calculator if you want to. So in the end, you will end up getting that S equals approximately 5.333333. You can write it as 3 repeating, or actually the preferred way of that is just to round it to the nearest hundredth. So we're going to write it as 5.33. It's actually 5 1/3. And the one important thing that a lot of people forget is that you need to write the units out. So we had miles for our distance. We had hours for our time. So this is going to be in miles per hour.